Opening the center with the queen's pawn immediately stakes a claim and prepares for rapid development. Developing the knight to f6 is a flexible response, keeping options open for pawn structures and piece play. Immediately contests central space and opens diagonals for queenside development. Preparing a solid pawn structure, black signals a cautious approach and aims for central influence. Developing the knight prepares for central expansion and potential kingside pressure. This solidifies the pawn center, opening lines for bishop development. Shattering central pawn structure, white opens lines for aggressive piece play and claims more space. Recapturing with the pawn reestablishes central pawn structure, offering equal development chances. Developing the bishop here pins the knight, creating immediate central pressure and disrupting black's pawn structure. Solidifying the pawn chain, black prepares for a positional struggle, reinforcing their central structure. Solidifying the center and preparing bishop development, this move aims for harmonious piece placement. Developing the bishop to a natural square, reinforcing the kingside and preparing for kingside castling, solidifying the central structure. Developing the bishop to the active diagonal clears the e-file, preparing castling while eyeing the kingside. Sharpening the diagonal pressure, black aims to disrupt white's harmonious development and create tactical opportunities. Securing the queen on a central file now prepares for a potential kingside attack and adds support to the central pawn structure. Sacrificing the bishop's influence here surrenders control of vital central diagonals, leaving the kingside potentially exposed to future pressure. Sacrificing the bishop clears the diagonal, potentially isolating black's queen and weakening their pawn structure for a future attack. Black recaptures, solidifying the pawn structure and developing a piece to an active square, ready for further central engagement. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside opens new avenues for your king's assault, but it weakens your own pawn shield. Unyielding pawn structure solidifies the center, preparing a robust kingside defense against anticipated aggression. Sacrificing space to gain initiative, white boldly pushes forward, aiming to restrict black's kingside mobility. Pushing the g-pawn creates weaknesses around the king, potentially opening lines for attack or providing a crucial outpost for a knight. Challenging the bishop's position forces an immediate decision, potentially creating pawn weaknesses or offering tactical opportunities. Exchanging the bishop sacrifices piece activity for a more solid structure, potentially simplifying into a position where white's pawn majority will be a key factor. Sacrificing the bishop opens the g-file, creating immediate attacking potential against black's weakened kingside. Opening the g-file offers attacking chances, but severely weakens your king's sanctuary. Developing the knight to this square aims to reinforce the center and potentially eye the kingside. The bishop's sudden foray creates a dynamic tension, challenging white's king's safety and opening up unexpected attacking avenues. Challenging black's aggressive pawn push, white aims to secure the kingside and potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure. The bishop now returns to a square that solidifies its influence on the kingside, preparing for potential pawn advances. Securing the monarch immediately fortifies white's central position and prepares for a potential kingside advance. Sacrificing the bishop opens lines towards the king, creating immediate tactical fireworks and forcing white into a defensive posture. Securing the king's retreat to a safer square initiates a crucial defensive repositioning. Unleashing the knight to d7 frees up the e-pawn and eyes potential central breaks, a promising maneuver for queenside activity. Liberating the rook opens critical lines, aiming to exploit black's exposed king and pawn structure. Sensing an opportunity, black attempts to centralize the queen and exploit white's slightly exposed king. Gaining dominion over the f-file offers white attacking potential against black's somewhat exposed king. Reinforcing the kingside pawn chain, this solidifies the defense but relinquishes an attacking pawn's initiative. Seeking to dominate the f-file, this repositioning readies a potential kingside assault. Securing the king amid the storm offers vital breathing room, though it opens the door to future queenside infiltration. Unleashing the rook on the kingside assault, targeting that exposed enemy monarch. Pushing the f-pawn opens the floodgates, creating significant structural weaknesses for black's king. Reasserting central influence, the knight redeploys to a commanding square, eyeing the queenside and preparing to support a pawn advance. Reasserting influence on the king's side, black repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses. Pushing this pawn aims to disrupt black's bishop-knight coordination and potentially open the king's defenses. Relocating the bishop aims to prepare its redeployment through the king's side, potentially menacing the castled king. Opening the e-file now threatens to unravel black's kingside pawn structure if the bishop retreats. Unburdening the queen from defending the pawn, it eyes the vulnerable kingside and seeks new activity. Reclaiming the pawn opens the f-file, a promising avenue for attacking the exposed black king. Regaining central influence and freeing the bishop is the immediate goal here, preparing for a more active piece deployment. Reasserting control of the central squares and preparing for potential piece exchanges to simplify the position. Introducing immense activity to the kingside, black sacrifices material for an onslaught on white's monarch. Unlocking the central files now grants white a dynamic initiative against black's slightly disjointed pieces. The queen reroutes, seeking support behind the beleaguered pawn chain, hinting at a long-term battle for central influence. The rook's ascent intensifies the kingside pressure, threatening to pierce the pawn's shield protecting black's monarch. Pondering a raid on white's kingside, this queen finds herself exposed amidst the enemy ranks. A daring simplification that clears the board, potentially leading to a sharper endgame where queens are absent. The king's exposed position after the queen exchange opens up a new battlefield for the remaining pieces. Unlocking the kingside, this knight jump seeks to disrupt black's pawn structure and create new attacking avenues. Hoping to exploit the open e-file and pressure white's isolated queenside pawns, but this might be too passive for the current material balance. Securing the king's safety, this move prepares to reorganize the beleaguered queenside defense and potentially launch a counter-initiative on the open central files. Injecting a pawn into the center, black fights for space and disrupts white's established pawn structure. Seizing open lines now, white aims to exploit the exposed black king and centralize powerful pieces. Reclaiming a pawn, black's knight now occupies a commanding central square, eyeing potential pawn breaks and bolstering defenses. Exploiting the open king position with a forcing knight check, this aims to disrupt black's coordination. King safety is paramount, as the doubled pawns now offer scant protection against the encroaching knights. Challenging black's tenacious defense, the knight's repositioning aims to exploit open lines and threaten the weakened kingside. Reasserting presence on the open files, the bishop repositions to deter pawn advances and potentially support a later kingside attack. Gaining crucial space on the kingside, this rook redeployment aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and target weaker squares. Reclaiming central space is the immediate priority, as the white knight is precariously positioned. This pawn advances to assert dominion over the crucial central squares, aiming to restrict black's knight and potentially open lines for further piece activity. A valiant attempt to activate the knight, but it overlooks the pending threat of the white rook on the queenside. Seizing the open file offers attacking chances, but be wary of the doubled pawns on the kingside. Seizing initiative, capturing that knight forces a king relocation and disrupts white's pawn structure. Clearing the king's escape route secures material advantage after the forced exchange. The black king's escape route has been significantly compromised by the pawn structure and bishop exchange, demanding vigilant defense. Securing the advanced pawn against black's knight opens the path for further pressure on the kingside. Relocating the monarch offers some breathing room from immediate threats, preparing to contest the open files. Unleashing the knight to the h6 outpost, aiming to pressure black's isolated pawns and disrupt any defensive setup. A desperate attempt to free the rook, but the passed pawn on the b-file now becomes a major threat. Invading the weakened queenside offers a tactical advantage, potentially forcing pawn weaknesses. The bishop repositions, anticipating a potential pawn push on the queenside to disrupt white's piece coordination. Seizing the opportunity to widen the board and potentially exploit weaknesses on the queenside. Patience is key. The knight's retreat repositions for a potential queenside push, aiming to exploit the isolated pawn. Seizing the open b-file offers a potential avenue for the queen and rooks to penetrate black's position. Asserting control over the open c-file, this knight maneuver prepares for central breakthrough. Reclaiming central influence, this knight repositioning eyes the weak pawn structure and prepares to exploit the open files. Challenging white's pawn structure offers a glimmer of counterplay, though the immediate threat on the knight demands attention. Reclaiming the open file now allows white to organize a more robust defense against black's encroaching knights and pawn majority. A desperate bid to disrupt white's consolidating pawns with a desperate check. Securing the passed pawn's advance is the immediate priority, forcing the black rook back. Sacrificing the rook cleans up the pawn structure and simplifies into an endgame where the knight can prove problematic. Securing the king's shelter becomes the paramount objective now that the opponent's final attack has been parried. The bishop retreats, preserving its influence on the vital light squares while preparing to contest the central pawns. Activating the knight to a central outpost targets black's weakened pawn structure and opens avenues for attack. Consolidating the king's defensive structure becomes the immediate priority, as the enemy knight eyes advancing opportunities. Maneuvering the king toward the center is a prime endgame objective, aiming to activate its defensive and offensive potential. Seeking to unravel white's blockade by activating the king through the center. Shifting the knight to a more active square, aiming to outmaneuver black's pawns. Aiding the knight's repositioning, the bishop vacates the diagonal for a more active role. Attempting to activate the kingside pawns now might overextend them, leaving white's monarch exposed. Prioritizing the centralization of the king, a bold thrust to seize the initiative. Pioneering a new pawn frontier, this advance seeks to liberate the knight and destabilize black's tightly packed defensive structure. Protecting the knight's path to d4 now becomes crucial, as a successful advance there would be devastating. Securing the kingside, but the centralized pawn island becomes a target. Pushing the king into the center now risks falling prey to discovered attacks. Unleashing a knight to a strong outpost, aiming to exploit the exposed black king. The knight's retreat to the queenside opens up a critical diagonal for the king, potentially creating new tactical opportunities. Pushing the h-pawn creates a passed pawn opportunity, a crucial endgame advantage with few pieces remaining. A last-ditch attempt to outmaneuver the knight and seize the open d-file. Pawns on the queenside can now advance, aiming to create a passed pawn. Snatching that pawn opens a dangerous diagonal for your king, better to consolidate your pieces. Unleashing the king to its most active outpost, threatening to swallow those isolated pawns and dominate the center. Controlling the central files allows the bishop to influence the remaining board. Sacrificing pawn structure for an open path to the black king's quarters demands vigilance. Opening a vital diagonal for the king, accepting the pawn sacrifice to create play. Creating a passer on the queenside with the pawn sacrifice opens up black's king for potential future attacks. The bishop retreats, regrouping to support the king's perilous journey across the board. Targeting the bishop with the knight now frees the king and prepares to advance the pawn. Embracing the endgame transition, the bishop retreats to defend the pawn's advance. Advancing the monarch, though seemingly bold, risks exposing it to further complications with the bishop's activity.